Good morning, everyone. Okay, we are up to Perek Hey Mishna Hey. Mishnah begins Alekeach Yesterday Yerek Basuria. Somebody who buys a vegetable field in Syria. So Syria is the lands of Aram, which were conquered and annexed to Eretz Yisrael by David Amalek, by King David. These lands are to the northeast of the land of Israel, and for some laws they're considered like Eretz Yisrael, like the land of Israel, and for other laws they are not. When it comes to Truma and Meiser, from what grows in Syria, if a Jew owns the field, then he has to take Trumas and Meisers from it. If a non-Jew owns the field, then there is no obligation. So the Mishnah reads like this. Halokeach Sedei Yerek Basuria, a person buys a vegetable field in Syria. Im Achelei Balo Ines HaMaisris, if he bought it before what's growing there came to the point of being subject to Maisris, which we've been learning until now means, is that the first stage of produce being subject to the laws of Maisris, which means, practically speaking, you can snack, but you can't eat regularly from it, is when it begins to become edible. Stages for that. Here, the point is, when you bought this field of vegetables in Syria from the non-Jew, you bought it before it became subject to the laws of Maisris, before it became subject to the time, to the stage of Maisris. Meaning it's before anything, any kind of law of Truma and Meiser should become applicable to this produce. It's not there yet. You can eat regularly from it if you wanted to, practically speaking. So it hasn't come to the point of being subject to the laws of Maisris, or Trumas and Maisris. If that's when you bought it, chayiv, then eventually you will become obligated. You will become obligated in separating Trumas and Maisris. Why? Because at some point, it's going to continue growing. It's going to come to the Unas HaMaisris. It's going to come to the stage of being subject to the laws of Maisris. And where did it happen? Where and when did that happen? It happened under the ownership of a Jew. Since it came to the stage of Maisris under Jewish ownership, then it becomes liable to the laws of Trumas and Maisris. However, Umishabalo Unas HaMaisris, but let's say you bought it afterwards, when you bought it once it already came to the stage of being subject to the laws of Maisris. And when did that happen? That happened under the ownership of a non-Jew, patur, then you're exempt. Because the status of this grain depends on under whose ownership it was when it came to the stage of being subject to the laws of Maisris. If it came to that stage by the non-Jew, that means at the point where the stage of Meiser should become effect, it was owned by a non-Jew, and by a non-Jew that doesn't happen in Syria. Therefore, even though a Jew buys it afterwards, once it was exempt, it stays exempt. So if you buy it before it comes to the stage of Maisris, So if you buy it before the stage of Maisris, before it comes to that stage, then when it came to that stage, it was under a Jew's ownership. So he's liable. Because the stage of Maisris came when a Jew owned it, which is where in Syria, that's going to be the law. But if it was under the non-Jew's ownership when it came to the stage of Maisris, which means at the point where that stage should have come, it belongs to the non-Jew, even though the Jew buys it afterwards. So he has it once it has physically come to the stage of Maisris. Nonetheless, being that when the stage of Maisris was supposed to happen, it was under the non-Jew's ownership. At that point, it didn't happen. And in this situation, the Mishnah says, and you can just go ahead and collect regularly and move on. Meaning that even though it will grow more under the Jews' ownership, Doesn't make a difference. You can just go ahead, let it grow to whatever stage you want, collect it, do what you want. You don't got to worry about Trumas and Maasros. Because if at the point where the Onas HaMaasros, when the stage of Maasros should have happened, it didn't come into effect because it was owned by a non-Jew, even when it grows afterwards, under the Jew's ownership, it's still exempt from Trumas and Maasros. So that is the opinion of the Tanna Kama, the first opinion mentioned here in the Mishnah. Now, the next line in the Mishnah is going to show us something that we don't see explicitly in the words of the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda says, Af yiskar payalim v'yolkaid. You can even hire workers and collect. So Rabbi Yehuda adds something here, which isn't explicit in the Mishnah, but really has to be read into the Mishnah. And that is when the Tanna Kama said that you're exempt once it came to the stage of Maasros under the ownership of the non-Jew. And then it says, V'loiked kedarka v'hailech, he can collect regularly and continue. It says, V'loiked, he collects. The owner does the collecting. He cannot hire workers to collect, which is why Rabbi Yehuda then says he could even hire workers and collect. Why shouldn't you be able to hire workers? So according to the Tanna Kama, the explanation is that being that there is a difference when you buy this grain in Syria from the non-Jew, whether you bought it before it came to the stage of Maasros or after. Before you bought it for the stage of Maasros, you do have to separate Trumas and Maasros. If you bought it afterwards, you don't. Even when you don't, the sages wanted, excuse me, Any questions? Right. By the way, what you're talking about, you put it in the steps. Sorry about that. I'm back. We now return to our regular programming. Somebody banged on the door like that. I don't know what it was. Okay. Okay. Back to what we're saying. So, according to the Tanna Kama, even when we say you're exempt from Trumas and Maasros because it was by the non-Jew when it came to the stage of Maasros, nonetheless, the sages wanted it to be clear that there's something unique here. They were concerned that we didn't do something special or something different when you don't have to separate Trumas and Maasros. We're concerned that people get confused and say the same way here, meaning when you bought it after it came to the stage of Maasros, you're exempt, even if you bought it before you're exempt. So they felt we have to make, in order to avoid that confusion, we've got to make some kind of a recognition when you don't have to separate Trumas and Maasros that there's something different here. And that was, you have to do it yourself. You can't hire workers. Rabbi Yehuda says, we don't need to do that. We don't have to worry about the confusion when it comes in this case, and therefore hire your workers, do it yourself, hire your workers. And again, you don't have to separate Trumas and Maasros. Everybody agrees to that. According to the Tanna Kama, you got to do something different. There has to be something different here for people to realize that things are different here. And that is no workers. Rabbi Yehuda says you don't have to go so far and you can hire workers. Okay. Now, Amar Shimon ben Gamliel. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said, Shimon the son of Gamliel said, excuse me. When are these words said? Meaning Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is going to tell us that what the Tanna Kama said, which is he made a distinction between whether it came to the point of, whether it came to the stage of Maasros or not when you purchased it. When do we make these distinctions? Bizman shekana karka. That's when you actually bought the land, meaning you bought the land and the produce. But if you didn't purchase the land, if it is before, even if it's before it came to the stage of Maasros, Pater, you are exempt. According to Rabbi Gamliel, it works like this. The only time the fact that it came under a Jew's ownership will make a difference is if the Jew owns the land and the produce. That is when we say, okay, you own the land. It came, what was growing from this land came to the stage of Maasros. It's before, when you bought it was before the stage of Maasros. So it came to the stage of Maasros when a Jew owned the land and the produce. That is when we say, at this point where you purchased it before it came to the stage of Maasros, so that when it came to that stage, it was under your ownership. If you own the land, then we say, okay, you're going to be Chai ben Shumas and Maasros. But let's say we're only talking about the produce. You didn't buy the land. You bought this produce. You bought the produce alone. You don't buy the land. The growing fruits are yours. So it's going to come out that you bought these fruits before they came to the stage of Maasros. You own the fruits when they come to the stage of Maasros, but you didn't own the land. And since at the end of the day, you didn't own the land when it came to the point of Maasros, that means it grew off the non-Jew's land, even when it came to the stage of Maasros. Even though you own the produce, you will not be liable. You will not have the obligation of Shumas and Maasros from this. Tanna Kama holds that even if you just bought the produce, if it came to the stage of Maasros, if it came to that stage while it was yours, then you don't own the land. Nonetheless, the produce came to the stage of Maasros under the ownership of a Jew. Then it's going to have the obligation. Then you have to separate Shumas and Maasros from it. Rabbi Gamliel argues, and he says that no, in order for that to happen, to say that since it came under the Jew's ownership, that's when it came to the stage of Maasros, to say that then you're obligated to separate Shumas and Maasros, that only happens when the Jew actually owns the land when that happens. But if the non-Jew owns the land when that happens, then at the end of the day, it's growing out of a non-Jew's land at that point when it comes subject to Shumas and Maasros, no obligation takes effect. That's from Gamliel's opinion. And the Bartanura says that the halacha is like Shimon ben Gamliel. That's the halacha. Now, the final part of the Mishnah is again going back on a different part of what the Tanna Kama said. Rebbe Omer, Rebbe, the sage known as Rebbe, that was Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince. He said, Af lafi cheshbon, you even have to separate according to the proportion. That means like this. Tanna Kama said, the first opinion of the Mishnah said that if you buy it, once it comes to the point after it's subject to the laws of Maasros, okay, if you buy it at that point, Tanna Kama said, whatever what grew, what will grow, not subject to the laws of Shumas and Maasros. Rabbi says, what grew, meaning when it became subject to the laws of Maasros by the non-Jew, what already grew what already grew before you bought it, or what already grew when you bought it, that's not subject to Shumas and Maasros. But what grows after is, because what grows after is growing subject to the laws of Maasros under the ownership of the Jew. Yes, what grew before wasn't under the ownership of the Jew. The Shumas and Maasros didn't take effect then, and that much that grew, it never will. But what grows further, which is growing at the stage of being subject to Shumas and Maasros, and it belongs to a Jew then, that proportion you have to separate Shumas and Maasros from. So if, let's say, for example, it grew to a third of its stage of ripeness, which for some produce is already considered edible. So at that point, it came to the stage of Maisris, a third came to the stage of Maisris. It was under the ownership of a non-Jew. That much from that part, you don't get a separate Shemis and Maisris. But the other 2/3 that you allow to grow till it's fully grown and fully ripened, that much, and when that happens, it means there's more of it that's going to grow, two more thirds of it that's going to grow more, right? As it becomes more ripe, as it becomes completely edible, the amount that it grew more, so get say 1/3 the growth, right? At that stage it was edible, and it came to the point of Maisris. So that first 1/3, since that happened under the ownership of a non-Jew, is exempt. But the other 2/3 that grow, they grew at the stage of being subject to Maisris. They belong to the Jew. Those 2/3 you will have separate Shemis and Maisris from. That is what Rebbe argued on the Tanakama, on the first opinion of Mishnah. Okay. Okay, now we move on to the laws of Lashon Harah from the Chavetz Chaim. Okay, Ein Chiluk. Chavetz Chaim writes, there is no difference, the Isser HaSipur, regarding the prohibition of speaking Lashon Harah, Beinim Sipra me Atzmai Beretzainai, whether he willingly or he voluntarily spoke Lashon Harah, Ubeinim Amar Alav Chaveirei B'Devar V'Hiftzirei At Shesiprlai, or his friend pressured him into doing it. Meaning sometimes you will offer Lashon Harah on your own, and then sometimes somebody's pressuring you. Come on, tell me what happened. I got to know what happened. You got to tell me what happened. And because of that pressure, you caved in and spoke Lashon Harah. You come back a maser. Now, and even if, let's say, the person asking you or pressuring you is your father or your Rebbe, and these are people that you're obligated to honor them, to revere them, and not to go against their words. If they ask regarding a certain subject, and you know that by telling them what happened, you will be speaking Lashon Harah, or even what's called avak Lashon Harah, a dusting, very indirect Lashon Harah, which we'll learn about the prohibition regarding that. So I mean, it's a lesser form of Lashon Harah, but it's still considered Lashon Harah. Also, l'shmaya lahem, it is forbidden for a person to listen to them. Not permitted to listen to them, to that pressure, and to give in. Now, there may be times where what they're asking you, they're allowed to ask you, even for the derogatory, for information. And in those circumstances, you answer. But if we're talking about here, if they're asking you about something, to know about something, and you know that within that story, you will be saying that is Lashon Harah. It's not allowed to be said. Even though the request for that information came from your father or your rabbi, nonetheless, you are not permitted to do so. You're not permitted to reveal it. Have a wonderful day.